Hi, everyone. I'm Suraj. I'm here to share a little bit of my learnings on a recent application I've been working on. I used a JavaScript library named Knockout. Just thought I'll post this. It might be of some use for somebody out there. Knockout has been around for a while. It has been in use, I would say, since 2009, 2010. The last update, I think, has been done on around 2019. So it's not as active as a couple of other JavaScript front-end projects. But it has got quite a few nice features, which really helped me a lot. Couple of things. First thing, it's probably one of the easiest one to integrate into an existing application. The barrier of entry is very minimal. It's pure JavaScript, extremely light, and very rich in features. So the learning curve won't be that high. So depending on a particular use case, Knockout could still be the better option. Okay. I'll go about what my project was and what I'm going to share. So this is the website. The key features that talk about declarative bindings. So what the model really is, they have the design pattern followed is model, view, and view model. Essentially, what is being done is instead of working on the DOM element of a page, you extract the thing out and create a model of the page, some outside, and then you work on the model and create properties, and then you work on this, and then leave it to Knockout to integrate your model with the actual visual rendering. Okay, so that is the idea. So you do that by doing making declarative bindings into the DOM elements. So, HTML template, you would have some extra tokens, bindings that would link your model with your DOM. Okay, that's the first aspect of it. Once that is done, it enables a two-way binding. When your model changes, Knockout would kick in and refresh the front end. Other way around too, when the DOM element changes, it would know that, and then it'll bring the change back to the model. And that is the automatic UI refresh. And that is done using a concept internally. They have a publish subscribe mechanism that Knockout has. And on top of that, they create a model called the observable. So observable means you can observe certain properties, and whenever a change happens, that recent change will be triggered using a callback. So the way that is done using observables, and behind that you have a publish subscribe paradigm implemented. It's all native to Knockout. It's not the publish subscribe in any other JavaScript library, requireJS, something else. This is all internal to Knockout. The publish subscribe is designed primarily to work as a link between the front end, the GUI, and your model. So using that, you have the automatic refresh, and you build in your dependency tracking by using that observable features inside. Okay. And of course, there's a templating where your model is created using a template, and then in the HTML template, you can tag it certain things, and then make it easier. I'll come to that when I show my application. A couple of things I did was, since the application I'm going to share, it's not just about Knockout. I had to integrate a couple of other very good JavaScript libraries to get the full features I was needing. I'll talk about that also. Okay, so that's a goal. Talk about Knockout and how Knockout has been integrated using a few other JavaScript libraries, and one of them is requireJS. Other is JavaScript widgets library called jQWidgets. I'll show you here. This is requireJS. It's basically a JavaScript file and module loader. The key concept is, instead of pulling in all your JavaScript files in a traditional script tag, let's say it might work for a smaller application, but when it scales up, managing all the files and loading all the files upfront would be a problem. First case would be it'll take time to load. Other thing would be you should be aware of the dependencies and which script depends on the other one, and the order of launching or loading becomes important. So what requireJS does is you just create a list of files and JavaScript modules, and then you would say my application is dependent on this set of files and JavaScript modules. Once that is done, you load all those things, and it's not done in a serial way. It is done async. So your loading time will be faster. And then once everything is loaded, you trigger a callback function that can initiate your application. This link has quite a bit of features. If you want, should go and look into it. So I'll talk about that, what I did for this. Other thing is there is an application called jQWidgets. You can see that here. Widgets. Yeah, this is a very powerful library. It's commercial, but they do have a free version which you could download, and it's very tightly integrated within Knockout JavaScript. They also have bindings for other toolkits. You can see here, Angular, all those things. Okay. So I have used that. And then I have used requireJS. I have used jQWidgets. Okay. Now let me go to the application, and then we'll work backwards. I'll show the model application I want to show, and then I'll go back to the code, and then we'll dig into what features of Knockout or what features of other libraries have been used. And that is a goal. I'm not going to go in a step-by-step tutorial thing. I'm just straight away going to the application and then point out what features comes and where. Cool. So this is the application. As I said, it integrates Knockout, jQuery, jQuery 2. I'm using jQuery library as integration, and jQWidgets requireJS. All it does is it has got a front end page. The front page basically has two components. Let me talk about components before I get any further. So one of the recommended practice in Knockout is how to create components. So a component means you encapsulate certain feature sets needed into a self-contained component. And component is nothing but a collection of a model. Model means the data you want to show, and then a template and how you want to render it. So a collection of the view model, the visual aspect you want to see on the screen, and how to render the data, the model that would make up the visual, and then how exactly that visual component is rendered. That collection, that union is what is termed as a component. So there are best practices. So I have picked up one of those recommended best practices by Knockout. So we have two components here. One is a charting component. I have used a jQWidgets library here. And then other is just a component here. All it does is it's just a grid that displays some data, right? And then once that is done, I'm just tightly integrating that using a couple of observables, and how the link between the model and the DOM is all done behind the scenes. Okay, so let's go into this application. As I said, I have two components. Each component is being rendered 3 times. So 1, 2, 3, they're all the same component. I'm showing it twice. And then I have another component chart, 1, 2, 3. Okay. So what this does is it has got certain features. This is hidden by default. Then you would add. Or I have an internal, I have a list of codes. Then it randomly picks up one each time I add. Okay. So you can see that it randomly picks up add. You can individually delete certain things here. You can hide it, unhide it, or you can delete the whole thing. Same thing goes with the same, because it's the same component just being rendered multiple times, the behavior is the same. Okay. That's the same thing here. I'm not going to do code. So I'm going to see, so now I have other things. The second section here is just a table. This chart, first I talked about the component, the grid. The second is a chart. It's a simple chart I picked from jQWidgets. It's a bar chart. All it does is it puts in some data like exercise, the duration in minutes for 3 persons here. And then that again, I have one chart works off the same data set. And then when I click this randomize button, it will randomize the data. So see what happens. As I said, it's just one component or one chart using the same data rendered 3 times. That's why you see when I randomize here, it changes all. And this second part of the grid is just the same data represented in a tabular format. Okay. To keep this in mind, I'm going to come back and show you a different behavior once you change certain aspect of the chart. Okay, so now everything, when I click any of the randomize, all 3 changes. But if I make certain changes, I can localize the data to one chart. So this component, instead of working off the same global data that has been passed to it, it can as well, once the data set is stored, the component can have a local copy of the data. Okay, and that data can be stored within the component. And then when you click here, just a minimal change within the component, I can configure it to work off the local data. And then once that happens, you won't see this behavior. It will work on off locally. Okay, we'll come to that. So how this is done in Knockout is you have a master page. In master page, you have to create a model of the master page. And within that page, you would call out 2 components. Okay. Now I'm going to go into the code here. This is the master page. If you see here, all it does is it calls in the requireJS. This is what I mentioned earlier. This is a JavaScript library used to load scripts and files asynchronously. Okay, so all you do is you have to you're telling to run this as a startup script, and within that you would configure the dependencies, and this is the toolkit use. If you read through that, the documentation here, they are implementing a model called AMD asynchronous module definition. It has been used. There's a lot of discussion on how this is AMD is different from CommonJS, other similar concepts. You can strongly suggest you to go to the require.js and learn more about it. But I found it extremely useful. It's extremely flexible. It makes life a lot easier. Let me go straight into the dependency for this init.js here. Okay. Goes here, this thing. Okay, so this is the config for the require. All it says is it is giving a text name, okay, and then it is actually giving it a path where the knockout JavaScript is. Or you have to omit the .js extension. The text is similarly it's a plugin of required.js plugin to required.js. what it does is it basically loads text files. It's not necessarily JavaScript files. It could be, let's say, that my application here, I'm using text files to load the templates. Okay, template is not a JavaScript file, it's just a text file. It has to load the HTML file. And then using text plugin for requireJS, I'm able to load it right in an async manner. jQXall is basically loading the jQWidgets library here. Of course, jQuery is the jQuery library, and this is the custom app. So once this path is all being set, this is what I mentioned earlier. In requireJS, you just pass in the dependency. You need to, my application is dependent on all these modules or text files here. And then once all these are loaded in an async manner, I want to call this function here, JavaScript, and then it passes the same in the same sequence. Say in jQuery, I'm passing it as a $ here to refer to jQuery, Knockout, KO, and app. I'm not using these tokens inside, so I just drop it here. Right? And once that is done, Knockout really kicks in with this apply bindings. So once this apply bindings basically means this function, right? This function, app function, basically creates the model of the master page. So how that is done is, I will go there in a bit, but this basically it has a class and it has a constructor, and it creates an object which is the model, okay, which defines certain properties, and it has got components, other things. So apply bindings would need that, and then that would be the starting model. Okay. Let me go into the app bindings here. Okay, so this is the main model. They call it the top level view model. So all it does is it has to construct. It has to construct a class here. If you see here, it's a constructor. It load here. It has to load the two components. I named it the first component of the grid, which populates the codes I showed earlier. It is called first component, and it has a dependency here. I'm calling this is the model for that component. Okay, and then the second component is a chart component, and that is called chart model here. And what you see here is this is just a requirement for jQuery. Requirement for jQWidgets, because it is binding to the root here. So you can go and refer the documentation here. These two tags are necessary for jQWidgets to work, right? You have to set this knockout to root.knockout. Okay. So this define and require are coming from the requireJS library. So what is just defining this class, and then this class module, has a dependency on knockout, and knockout is what I configured in the init.js earlier. And then this is the app that gets passed here. So what it does is it basically creates, this is the knockout way of creating components. As I mentioned, this is the first component and the second chart component. And within the component, as I said earlier, a component is nothing but a union of the model and the template. So here, I would say this is the model, but once you go into the model, we'll see how it links the template to here. So this makes it very easy, just one model here, but this model actually links the template as well as the view model of the component. Okay. So we have three view models here. One is the view model of the parent. That is what this page is all about. And inside the page, I am having two components, and each component has got its own view model and its own template. Clear? And this is just the data, not going too much detail here. This is just the data needed to render the chart and the grid. Okay. This is just the settings for the chart, the JQ settings for the chart. Okay. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but this is a straightforward using a charting library. I've got a settings here to get the chart to work. And this is the data set. I'm creating the data for the chart. Okay, the chart I have to I have a collection of 7 days. I'm randomly putting in numbers here, initial data. Then I have a function here to update. Okay, it just updates the item. Basically, it randomly picks some number and updates it here. Okay. Okay, so this is the top level view model where the collection, the two components are defined, and the data, the first level data is maintained. And then let me go to the each of the components. Let's see here, the folder structure. I have a templates and view model. The template I have two, the first and the chart. Exactly the same thing for the view model. I have the first, the view model for the first component and the view model for the second. Let us start with the view model for the first. This is a view model for the component. So there are certain tags you see here, data bind. So that is where Knockout, this is a binding where how Knockout would integrate the DOM with the model. Okay, so if you see, there are certain kind of mechanisms we got to use. So data bind is the tag. We had to pass what is a binding. So there are some predefined binding, and then you can have custom binding. So this is a built-in binding by Knockout. It's a text. That means you want to display text name. Okay, so this name is this data bind has access to the model. So this name is actually set inside the model. Okay, let's be very clear. Data bind is a mechanism to bind the DOM with the model, and any binding here should have access to the model. And this text name, it basically printing the name. Okay, and here what it's doing is it has a click. It's just bind to the click event. So whenever that input, there is a button here, I'm adding a button, and that once that button is clicked, it runs a callback function called add code. Again, that add code function is built into the model. Okay. And this is the second level, the component, right? This is not the model of the parent. This is the model within the component. So this add code will be a callback function within the component called first component. Okay. Similarly, within this, as I mentioned earlier, I have integrated jQWidgets. So jQX button is it's a custom binding through which you can use jQWidgets. Okay, so this is a custom binding. So what does this mean is I'm binding and invoking a jQS button here and passing a template to this. Okay. Okay. So all I'm doing here is I'm putting a button here and then doing some events. When I click a button, I have an add button. When I click that, an add queue is being done, and that button is bound to jQS button. Okay, jQuery button, and in default value is add. So same thing here. You see, I have add button, I have delete button. The same, two buttons. They're coming from jQuery widgets, and using this data bind, it is using a jQuery is using a custom binding mechanism so that Knockout can use it. Yeah. Similarly, I have a simple check box button, which is just a flag that tells you hide and delete. Hide this variable when this property is checked. You just have a checkbox button, and when it's clicked, it sets this thing enable on and off. Okay, that's all it is. This enable button is within the model, and then comes we need to talk about custom binding here. As I said, there are some default bindings, then there are custom bindings. Okay, and this is a mechanism through which Knockout is calling a custom binding under whenever this enabled is 0, enable is unset, it would call a fade visible. So basically, I'm fading off the screen. If you see here, I add the buttons. Yeah, that aspect is being that feature is being set here, and this is where this enabled is being defined as an observable, right? Observable, it's not really it's an object, and that is why we have to use this parenthesis here to access the value of the object. Okay, so enable is declared as an observable so that Knockout can manage that two-way binding. Okay, so whenever that observable is unset, this fade visible is triggered, and all that fade visible is doing is it is using a jQuery inside to fade it. Okay, fade that entire div. So when this hide is set, the entire div gets faded. If you see, this whole div gets faded. Other than that, okay, the next binding, another built-in binding type is for each. All it does is this is an observable. There are two different types of observable. One is a observable and other is an observable array. So this items has been declared as an array. So what it does is this tag for each, it will loop through the array, right? So in the template, I'm using a for each loop so that it loops through the array and repeats it as many times. And for each loop, I am just printing the content of that code here. And then I'm doing some bindings again for that code. I can delete the code, or the same fade visible is there. I'll first fade that button and then I delete it. Okay. So you have to notice a couple of things here. One is the binding has, when you Knockout mentions binding, a binding has something called a context. So when it binds, let's say at the parent level, the binding context is the parent. That means visualize this as a stack, right? You have a main function calling a stack function. And when the call is done, it's the context, the stack frame switches to the called stack frame. And then when it returns, it goes back. Similar in concept. So the binding under certain scenarios, it is not that every data bind jumps to a different context. No, it depends on the call. So this, and it for each, it switches the context and it jumps into the context. So once it jumps into the context, it has access to the model data within that context. Okay. So in this for each, the context has changed. That's why I have to then from the inner thing context, if you want to access anything externally, you got to add certain predefined tokens here, and that's called a parent. Okay. So in this case, I need to, this is a component, one component called the first component, which is nothing but a grid. And the grid component has a model. And within the model, I am using within the template, I'm using a loop. And since it went into the loop, the context has switched into the looping context. And since I need to access delete callback, which is not in the for each, but outside of the model, I need to use delete. Okay. The same thing, I'm calling fading that thing when the enable this. I'm fading the that button in this case when delete is clicked. Okay. I want to go back and show you the view model for this component. Okay. It comes here, template. Okay, so this view model, this define is again coming from the requireJS. I mentioned earlier, requireJS has a plugin called text, and this exclamation mark here is just a syntax to text saying that it has a dependency on knockout module and also this HTML file. This HTML file is nothing but the template, right? So this is how it links the component is linking a component model to a component template. So this is the recommended practice within Knockout documentation, and I found it extremely clean, and you can really segregate. You don't have to bury in the template within the model. It is segregated, and you can dynamically pull it in as and when you need. So you have very nicely decoupled, by the way. And this is the model for the first component. Okay, all it does is I have all the codes defined here. This is standard JavaScript practice. I'm just redefining this to self. I mentioned earlier there are something called observable. So you can, any property here is converted to an knockout observable. I mentioned earlier, I just want to repeat, within observable is a mechanism where knockout is able to do the binding, and essentially what it's doing inside, it is doing a knockout specific publish subscribe on that any change on this property, and that is how it manages it. So you have to in this case, I'm just observing a name here. So any change, this self.name just basically making it an observable. Okay, and talk about the params. Params is basically it's a parameter. So anytime the parent, let me go back here. Yeah, when this is the main master page, this is where the component is getting loaded. When component is getting loaded, you can pass certain parameters to the function. It's just an object. You know? So this params is what gets passed on to the constructor of the component. Okay, so I'm just passing it values here. So that's what you would see there inside. Okay. And other thing is, since it can, in this case, it is just passing values here, but it can, in this case, when a chart component is being passed, I'm passing a value which is defined within the parent model, because this itself runs in the context of the parent model. So this has access to the model and properties defined in the parent. So items is nothing but a list, an array defined in the parent. So it's passing that. So in the chart, it's just passing that values. For the first component, it is just passing predefined values here. Okay. Now let me go back to the where am I? Okay. So this is how you, I talked about custom binding. So this is a key concept within Knockout. So you have a thing called binding handler. So you can define anything here, right? There I'm calling it a fade visible. So fade visible is nothing but what is being defined here. Sorry, it is defined in the defined here, right? So this is a custom binding. So yeah, I can define. I'm basically defining any custom binding, and it is being invoked when a parent is set to 0 in this case, and the same fade is an enabled property is 0. The fade visible um, is being invoked. Okay, so this is a key concept. So this is how. So basically, what this jQWidgets has done is they have created custom bindings for their library. So they're exposing the entire jQuery library has been integrated using custom bindings. So you can call out their APIs through this data binding mechanism. Okay. So jQuery button is nothing but if you check the code, it has to be defined as a custom binding inside. And here I'm passing the parameters. The simple example here I'm doing is I'm calling a custom fade visible here under certain scenario when enabled property observable enabled is unset. I'm calling a fade visible custom binding within the context of the first component model here. So what it's doing is it has got predefined mechanism. In if you read through the documentation, it knows which element is activated. It has got a value accessor. Value accessor is a mechanism to extract the current value. So all it's doing is it is when a click is made, the value accessor will tell when I extract the value out, it is set or unset. And depending on set or unset, I'm doing this values being either it's being fade in or fade out. Okay, the unset and unset. So this $sign is basically calling switching to jQuery here. So using jQuery, I'm dynamically fading it. That's all to it. Okay, so that's all it needs. So see the link between knockout, the data bind, the observable, and then at the very deep, I am using third-party jQuery library to invoke the actual fading here. Similarly, I have an add button I showed earlier. When an add button is done, see the thing here. This items is nothing but an observable array. Okay, observable array means it's a regular array, but it has been wrapped around using JavaScript. Knockout observable. And what that means is I'm just going to work with these items. I can add element to the items, I can remove it, and I don't worry about the rendering part of it. Each time I add, it automatically, since it's all wired up together, Knockout does the heavy lifting and renders it on the page. So I see here I have an add, I have a delete. So here I'm adding a code randomly into this list. And then I have del q basically means I'm looping through the entire thing. I delete the whole list. Okay. In this, I delete a specific row. I have a table, and inside the table, I can delete a specific line in the table. And here again, just want to see I'm using jQuery here to do a kind of visual slow slide up function here. Right. All it's doing is just removing the code, but that is wrapped around using jQuery slide up. Okay, that's all. This thing is just to find the jQuery DOM element. Okay. That's all. So the key is this is a component. Essentially, the component is the union of a model and a template. The template has been externalized. The template is being loaded via a file, HTML file. And then here it is returning an object, which is a view model and a template. Okay. So That is all it's doing to create a component. The component is created by returning a model and a template bound together. And within that model, you do whatever it takes, whatever your requirements are, to link up the front end or view and the model. That's all it is. Now let me go to the second component. Go back here. So we talked about this. This is the first component. I'm doing it 3 times. That's why I put in that. I'm doing the same thing for the second component. It's a chart component. I'm passing, as I said, items, which is it's observable array within that. And the same thing is being passed twice. Nothing fancy here. The same thing, but here instead of the first, it's a chart component. It's again exactly the same. It has got its own template. It has got its own component model. Let's go there. Chart component. Let's first go with the template. It's very simple. The template, the entire thing can be hidden or enabled. So that div, this can be this will be visible only in this set. Okay, and this enable is basically an observable. I'm calling out the chart here, and if you see here, this chart is within the component. It's not the parent, right? So in this case, the parent would be the first model. Okay, the main model that would come here, the app.js. Okay, because app.js is calling the chart component. Okay, so when I say parent, see what all it's doing is it's trying to access this settings. I have defined the chart settings inside the app component here, and it's trying to access that settings here. So it has to use that parent tag, because as I said, just like a stack, it has gone one level deeper. So to come back and access the parent, it has to have that parent tag. We chart component, we're here. Okay, it is using the chart. Basically, this is where the chart is being initialized. Okay, and then giving a couple of callbacks here. I have a button when you click background, random, it will randomize the data. Again, it is invoking a function in the parent, which will randomize the data. Okay. And then the last one, I'm just having a table to render it, right? So if you saw that table below, every chart, there was a table which will give you the data. All of this, it goes through the parent and then displays I mentioned earlier, it goes to a for each loop, and then prints it using the built-in binding called text data binding to access the day. These are all defined in the model. Okay. Now let me go back to the model of the chart. Okay, it has got item here. So one thing I want to say is I know I mentioned earlier the chart settings is being called out from the parent, but just for a test case, I also defined settings called chart settings, exactly the same settings locally within the component. Okay. And similarly, I have an update button, and this is just to demonstrate certain feature sets I'm going to use. Ideally, this piece is not needed. Okay. Okay. So all it's doing is it is passing whatever parameters is being passed here. In this case, what it is doing is the parameters is being passed from the parent okay? And it's keeping a local copy of it. All it's doing is it's creating an observable array and doing a slice of JavaScript here. All it's doing is it's taking a copy of that array and creating a local copy, okay? Okay. So now let's, I want to go back and let us come back here. See, so this is all clear. When I click here, everything changes. I just want to demonstrate one last thing before I wind up. Now, what would happen if I in the chart view model, I'm going to change here, right? Instead of the parent, I can just remove the parent. I'm using the chart settings, which is defined. Similarly, I'm using the settings. I'm just doing a local copy of it. Okay. So all it's doing is, as I mentioned, the very first part of this presentation, I'm using the data. I'm using a copy, the local copy of the data within the component, and render it there. I was able to do that just by changing the reference here. So here, when I say data bind, I'm binding to local settings, chart settings here. Okay. Similarly, when I click an update button, I'm using the update button function, which is defined in the component model. Okay. Similarly, when I define here, I'm looping through this the items, which is available locally. Okay. I'm going to save it just in case, and then see what happens now. To refresh. See that. So now the behavior has changed. So when I click here, it just renders the chart. So this data, this is just a test case. I just want to see how I was able to simply switch the data from the parent to the component just by switching the template settings, and then you could make it work. The same thing works. I haven't changed it here, so this is anyway local. Okay. Delete. So that is about it. I want to share. Let me recognize this. Just want to cover one last thing. Just want to refresh. So what all we have is I have a master page here, which is called Knockout.html. I am using two components. First component and the chart component. Each component is being instantiated 3 times. It's the same component, but it's being shown 3 times. It is being passed different parameters. Okay, and each component has been created using the best practices mentioned in Knockout documentation, basically using a requireJS and trying to link component and a template. Right. Once that is done, I could use the tag here to refer to the template, to the component. Okay. Just want to come back. The model. So the model is nothing but this defined is coming from requireJS, and it is just having a dependency on Knockout and this text. And once this gets loaded, this function gets initiated. Once all it's doing in the function is creating a class or an object. It has a constructor, and that object is nothing but a collection of union of the model and the template. Okay. And it's joining, returning an object, which is a union and a template. And the key part, I would say, the key feature, I would say, to really brings in all the power to Knockout is really the observable thing and how you can create custom binding pretty straightforward. If you see here, I have custom binding, this function here, right? So how easy it was for us to just create a binding handler, extend it, just put a tag here, and then you can read the documentation. You can define certain functions, callback things here when that DOM element gets updated. What do you want to do? There's also an init function, but it's not defined here because I didn't have anything to initialize. But this brings in a lot of power to Knockout, and it's using that binding handling power that third-party libraries can be integrated. And one example of that is how jQWidgets has been used. For that, I'll go to and this is nothing but I'm doing the chart model here. The chart model is also constructing a chart object here, which is a collection of model and the template. And the data for the chart, I just showed two ways of accessing the data. One, I was accessing the data from the parent. So when that happened, when I click randomize, since all three charts are using the same data, all of them got updated. And then when I changed back, and all I did was I moved the pointer to make the component, the chart component, point to the data, which is a local copy of it. And once that happened, you see the reaction, but it just updated the data. So that's about it. Try this out. And if you have any feedback, do let me know. I'm going to share this, whatever code I've done, hopefully in a GitHub site, and I'll share the link. Thank you so much. Appreciate